Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science channel. If you're looking for something relaxing, thoughtful, and quietly full of wonder to help you fall asleep, you've found the right place. Tonight we'll be drifting gently through the incredible story of human evolution, not as a textbook, but as a quiet exploration for curious minds. It's designed to quiet your thoughts and ease you into rest as we explore how our species came to be. From tree-dwelling primates to tool makers, fire starters and stargazers. It's a story told in footprints and fossils, in bones and DNA stretching across millions of years, and told softly, just for you. If you enjoy relaxing science videos like this, made to help you unwind or fall asleep, feel free to like the video and subscribe to the Sleepy Science channel. It helps more people find their way to this kind of calm, thoughtful science, and I'd love to hear where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether you're in Tokyo or Toronto, Cairo or Cape Town, you're welcome here. So settle in, let your body get heavy, and let's begin. Picture Earth around 66 million years ago, near the end of the Cretaceous period. Dinosaurs still ruled the land. Giant marine reptiles swam the oceans, and the skies were filled with the leathery wings of pterosaurs. Mammals existed too, but only in the shadows, small, warm-blooded, mostly nocturnal. They scurried underfoot, avoiding predators, eking out a living in a world not yet shaped for them. But then, in an instant measured by geological time, everything changed. A massive asteroid, roughly 10 kilometers wide, slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula. The impact triggered firestorms, tsunamis, and a global winter. When the dust finally settled, about 75% of all life on Earth had vanished. The age of dinosaurs had ended, and in the empty ecological space they left behind, mammals, and eventually primates, began to rise. In the aftermath of that extinction, the world was quieter, cooler, and more open. Forests began to spread, and with them came new opportunities for the surviving mammals. Among these were the first true primates, small, tree-dwelling creatures that would one day give rise to monkeys, apes, and eventually us. These early primates appeared sometime during the Paleocene and early Eocene epochs, around 55 to 60 million years ago. They were adapted for life in the trees, with hands and feet that could grasp branches, forward-facing eyes for judging distance, and a growing reliance on vision over smell. These adaptations might seem simple, but they were foundational. They allowed for more precise movement, better coordination, and a social awareness that would become central to primate life. Already, evolution was beginning to reward brains over brawn. If we look at the fossil record from this time, we find animals like Plesiadapis, one of the earliest known primate-like mammals, with flexible limbs and large eye sockets. Then, a bit later, creatures like Adapis and Notharctus, part of a group called the Adapiforms, which resemble modern lemurs. These early primates weren't ancestors of humans directly, but they were part of the broader primate radiation, the slow branching diversification of species that were adapting to arboreal life. Many of them were no larger than a squirrel, but inside their small skulls the brain was growing, particularly the parts responsible for processing visual information, social behavior, and motor control. Evolution was laying down the neurological groundwork for what would one day become tool use, language, and thought. As time went on, some primates remained nocturnal, like modern tarsiers, while others became active during the day, a shift that likely drove further improvements in vision and brain complexity. With daylight came new challenges and opportunities, better food sources, new predators, and richer social lives. Living in trees required coordination, but living in groups required intelligence. Navigation wasn't just about space, it became social. Who's dominant? Who's trustworthy? Who remembers where the fruit ripens first? Primate brains grew not just to solve physical problems, but social ones. And so, even tens of millions of years before humans walked the earth, the evolutionary pressure to think, to communicate, and to empathize was already shaping our distant ancestors. By the time we reached the Miocene epoch around 23 million years ago, primates had diversified dramatically. This was the age of the apes, a time when the planet was warmer, and dense forests stretched across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Dozens of ape species thrived during this period, many of them now extinct. These were not monkeys, but larger-bodied, tailless primates, creatures more closely related to us. They swung through trees with strong arms and flexible shoulders, and some were beginning to experiment with more ground-based movement. Among them was a wide cast of evolutionary experiments: Proconsul, Dryopithecus, Sivopithecus, Uranopithecus. Some were likely ancestral to modern apes, while others were evolutionary dead ends. But each left clues, in bone shape, in limb proportions, in dental wear, about the slow transition from forest canopy to open ground. One of the most intriguing fossils from this time is Sivopithecus, found in what is now India and Pakistan. Its face closely resembles that of modern orangutans, with a projecting jaw and wide-set eyes. Meanwhile, in Europe, Dryopithecus had limb proportions that suggest it could brachiate, swing from branch to branch, like gibbons and chimpanzees do today. Then there's Uranopithecus, discovered in Greece, which some paleoanthropologists once proposed as a possible ancestor to African apes and humans, though that claim remains debated. The fossil record here is tantalizing but fragmentary. Scattered jaws, teeth, partial skeletons. Yet these fragments whisper of a world where natural selection was fine-tuning body plans, adapting primates to new ecologies, and gradually paving the way toward the human lineage. Amid this rich evolutionary landscape, something began to shift in East Africa. Climate change, always a powerful sculptor of life, began to open up the forest canopy. Rainforests gave way to patchy woodlands and expanding savannas. With fewer trees came new pressures, longer distances between food sources, greater exposure to predators, and the need to move efficiently across open ground. It's in this changing environment that the first hominins, our direct ancestors, began to appear. These were not yet humans, not even close, but they were primates beginning to experiment with a very unusual trait, walking upright, and that one change, bipedalism, would set the stage for everything that followed. The shift to bipedalism is one of the most significant and mysterious transitions in our evolutionary history. Walking on two legs frees the hands for carrying and manipulating objects, and it allows for energy-efficient travel across long distances. But it also comes with trade-offs: slower sprinting speed, increased strain on the lower back and knees, and complications in childbirth due to the reshaped pelvis. So why did it evolve? There's no single answer. Some researchers point to the advantages of carrying food or infants. Others emphasize thermoregulation. Standing upright reduces sun exposure and helps the body stay cool on the open savanna. Still others suggest bipedalism was useful for scanning the horizon for danger, or even for wading through shallow water in search of food. It was likely a combination of these pressures interacting over millions of years that nudged our ancestors onto 2 feet. The earliest known hominin showing clear signs of bipedalism is Sahelanthropus chadensis, discovered in Chad and dated to about 7 million years ago. Its skull combines primitive features, like a small brain, with a surprisingly flat face and a foramen magnum, the hole through which the spinal cord exits the skull, positioned in a way that suggests upright posture. Not far behind is Aurorin tugenensis, found in Kenya, and dating to around 6 million years ago. Its femur hints at upright walking, though the fossil evidence is fragmentary. Then comes Ardipithecus ramidus, or Ardi, discovered in Ethiopia and dated to about 4.4 million years ago. Ardi's pelvis and foot anatomy show a fascinating blend of traits, adapted for walking on the ground, but still capable of climbing trees with a grasping big toe. These species didn't walk like we do. Their gait was awkward by modern standards, but they were clearly experimenting with bipedality, and that was enough to set them apart. With the rise of bipedalism came a cascade of evolutionary changes. The shape of the spine curved to support upright posture. The pelvis shortened and broadened to stabilize weight. The foot arched and the big toe aligned with the others to push off the ground. Even the hands changed. No longer needed for locomotion, they became available for fine manipulation, tool use, and eventually symbolic expression. Bipedalism didn't just alter the body. It changed how our ancestors interacted with the world. It opened up new ecological niches. It made long-distance travel possible. And perhaps most importantly, it began to shift the balance of survival, away from brute strength and toward adaptability, observation, and shared learning. By around 4 million years ago, the landscape of East Africa was home to a new kind of hominin, Australopithecus. These early human relatives were fully bipedal, yet still retained some traits of their arboreal ancestry. Long arms, curved fingers, and powerful upper bodies suited for climbing. One of the most famous species is Australopithecus afarensis, known best from an iconic fossil nicknamed Lucy, discovered in Ethiopia in 1974. Lucy stood just over a metre tall, with a small brain and a slender frame. Her pelvis and knee joints showed unmistakable adaptations for upright walking, while her shoulder blades and fingers hinted that she still spent time in the trees. This blend of traits captures a key theme in human evolution. Change doesn't happen all at once. Our ancestors were mosaics, part ape, part human, bridging two worlds at once. Lucy lived around 3.2 million years ago, but she was not alone. Australopithecus afarensis fossils have been found across East Africa, from Hadar in Ethiopia to Latoli in Tanzania. At Latoli, preserved in volcanic ash, researchers discovered something remarkable, a set of hominin footprints dated to about 3.6 million years ago. These prints show a bipedal gait, complete with an arch and forward-pointing big toe. Not so different from ours. They were likely left by a small group walking together, perhaps a family. For a moment, the past comes alive. Early humans moving across a quiet landscape, leaving behind shadows in stone. These footprints are among the oldest direct evidence of upright walking. Not just bones, but behavior captured in an instant, frozen for eternity. As Australopithecus species continued to diversify, they began to occupy a wider range of habitats. Fossils suggest they lived in wooded areas, open grasslands, and everything in between. They likely ate a varied diet of fruits, leaves, seeds, and occasional insects or small animals. Their teeth were adapted for chewing tough plant material, with thick enamel and strong jaws. This flexibility in diet may have been one of their greatest evolutionary advantages. In a changing climate, the ability to eat many things and live in many places is often more valuable than any single specialization. Australopithecus wasn't building tools or fire yet, but it was laying the groundwork for what would come next. Longer childhoods, stronger social bonds, and eventually, the first humans. Around 2.8 million years ago, a subtle but critical shift occurred in the fossil record. In the same East African regions once inhabited by Australopithecus, a new kind of hominin began to appear, one with a slightly larger brain, more human-like teeth, and hands better suited for precision gripping. These fossils mark the emergence of the genus Homo, and with it, the dawn of the human lineage. One of the earliest known members is Homo habilis, whose name means handy man. Fossils attributed to Homo habilis show a modest increase in brain size, from around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters in Australopithecus, to about 600 to 700 in early Homo. Still small by modern standards, but enough to suggest a shift in cognition. And nearby, often in the same sediment layers, archaeologists began to find something new: stone tools. The earliest tools were simple, just flakes struck from a core, sharp-edged and useful for cutting meat or scraping hides. These Oldowan tools, named after the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, represent a cognitive breakthrough. Their makers weren't just reacting to the world, they were shaping it. Tool-making requires planning, precision, and the ability to hold an idea in the mind, to see a rock not as it is, but as it could be. With these tools, early humans could access new food sources, scavenging meat from carcasses, cracking open bones for marrow, slicing through tough plant fiber. The diet became richer, more energy-dense, and energy in the evolutionary economy is fuel for the brain. With a better diet and more social cooperation, the brain continued to grow. Not rapidly, but steadily, generation by generation. By the time we reach Homo erectus around 2 million years ago, brain size had nearly doubled again, reaching about 900 cubic centimeters or more. But Homo erectus didn't just have a bigger brain, it had a new body, taller, more proportioned like ours, built for endurance walking and running. This was a species on the move. Fossils of Homo erectus have been found across Africa, the Middle East, India, China, and Indonesia. They were the first hominins to leave Africa in large numbers, adapting to new climates and ecosystems. And wherever they went, they brought their tools, their fire, and the beginnings of something we now call culture. Homo erectus is a milestone species, not just for its geographic spread or longevity, but for what it tells us about the mind of early humans. They lived in small, cooperative groups, likely communicated through vocalizations and gestures, and may have even had the beginnings of proto-language. Their toolkits evolved beyond the basic Oldowan flakes into what's known as the Acheulean tradition. Large, teardrop-shaped hand axes and cleavers, shaped on both sides, symmetrical and consistent across vast regions. These tools weren't just practical, they showed forethought and aesthetic preference. Some are so finely made, they may have been used for display or ritual. The appearance of standardization suggests teaching, that skills were passed down through observation and imitation. This wasn't just survival, it was tradition. Perhaps even more transformative than their tools was their mastery of fire. Evidence from sites like Kubifora in Kenya, Zhoukoudian in China, and Wonderwork Cave in South Africa points to controlled use of fire by Homo erectus as early as 1.5 million years ago. Fire changed everything. It allowed hominins to cook food, unlocking more calories and reducing chewing time. It provided warmth at night, safety from predators, and a central place to gather. Around fire, social bonds deepened. Stories may have been shared, even if not yet in full language. Skills were taught, meat was divided, alliances were made. Fire extended the day into night, and with it, the reach of human thought. This control over energy, both physical and social, may have reshaped more than behavior. Cooking likely influenced our biology. Over time, our jaws became smaller, our guts shorter, and our teeth less robust. The trade-off was more energy diverted to the brain. Fire, in this sense, was not just a tool. It was a feedback loop. The more we cooked, the better we nourished our bodies, the more brain power we could sustain, and the more sophisticated our culture could become. And all of this, migration, tool-making, fire, cooperation, happened before Homo sapiens even existed. The path to modern humans was not a sudden leap, but a series of slow, transformative steps, each one building on what came before. As Homo erectus spread across continents, evolution did not pause, it branched. Isolated populations adapted to different climates, ecosystems, and challenges. In some regions, Homo erectus gave rise to new species, each experimenting with the human form in slightly different ways. In Europe, around 800,000 years ago, emerged Homo heidelbergensis, a large-brained hominin with a more modern-looking skull and robust frame. In Africa, similar populations are sometimes considered late Homo erectus or early Homo sapiens. These transitional forms blur the boundaries between categories, reminding us that evolution is not a staircase, but a braided river, with channels that split, merge, and sometimes disappear entirely. Homo heidelbergensis is especially important because it appears to be the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. This species hunted large game, likely using wooden spears with sharpened tips. At sites like Schöningen in Germany, archaeologists have found spears over 2 meters long, carefully balanced and pointed, evidence of deliberate design. They also lived in shelters, controlled fire, and may have used pigments and early forms of symbolic behavior. Brain size in Homo heidelbergensis averaged over 1,200 cubic centimeters, nearly as large as our own. This was no longer just a clever primate. This was a being with foresight, cooperation, and perhaps even early ritual. From Homo heidelbergensis came 2 major evolutionary branches. In Europe and Western Asia, one lineage gave rise to the Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, while in Africa, another gave rise to Homo sapiens. These cousins would go on to coexist, compete, and interbreed. But for a long time they developed in parallel. Neanderthals, emerging around 400,000 years ago, were cold-adapted humans, shorter, stockier, with large noses and barrel chests. Their skeletons speak of strength and resilience. They hunted mammoths and rhinoceroses, lived in caves and buried their dead. And while they've long been portrayed as brutish or simple, the evidence tells a different story. Neanderthals made jewelry, used ochre, built structures, and cared for their injured. They weren't failed humans. They were another version of us. Meanwhile, in Africa, another lineage of hominins was taking shape, one that would eventually become us. The earliest fossils clearly attributable to Homo sapiens date back to around 300,000 years ago and were found at a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. These early humans had a mixture of modern and archaic traits: a relatively flat face, large brain case and slender limbs, but also robust brow ridges and elongated skulls. It's a reminder that evolution doesn't produce finished products all at once. early Homo sapiens were part of a broader spectrum of human diversity. Their brains were as large as ours, but their behavior was still emerging. They used stone tools, hunted cooperatively, and gathered plants. But the signs of symbolic thought, of culture and abstraction, were still faint, waiting to deepen. For tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens lived exclusively in Africa, sharing the continent with other hominins like Homo naledi, and perhaps isolated groups of Homo erectus. These early humans adapted to diverse landscapes, forests, deserts, highlands, coasts. Genetic studies suggest that our species did not arise from a single, isolated population, but rather from a network of interconnected groups spread across Africa. This idea, called the Pan-African model, proposes that Homo sapiens emerged gradually through the mixing and movement of many populations, each contributing traits that would become part of our shared inheritance. The human story, even at its origin, was a story of movement, exchange, and complexity. It's not until around 70,000 years ago that modern humans began to leave Africa in large numbers. What triggered this migration is still debated. Climate shifts, population pressures, or perhaps cultural and technological breakthroughs that made long-distance travel possible. Whatever the cause, Homo sapiens began to spread, first into the Middle East, then into Europe, Asia, and eventually the far corners of the earth. As we expanded, we encountered other hominins, most famously the Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia. And when we met them, we didn't just compete, we interbred. Today, most people of non-African ancestry carry between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. In parts of Asia and Oceania, people also carry traces of another mysterious cousin, the Denisovans, known mostly from a few bones and teeth found in a cave in Siberia. The spread of Homo sapiens across the globe wasn't just a story of movement. It was a cognitive revolution. Around 50,000 years ago, archaeological evidence begins to show a rapid expansion of symbolic and creative behavior. In Africa, we find beads made from pierced shells, carved ochre with geometric patterns, and pigment workshops for producing red and yellow dyes. In Europe, shortly after modern humans arrived, caves like Chauvet and Lascaux bloom with art, paintings of horses, lions, mammoths, and hands stenciled onto the stone, reaching across time. In Indonesia, similar art appears, drawings of wild pigs and human-animal hybrids etched in red pigment. These weren't decorations. They were expressions, symbols of memory, identity, perhaps even myth. This burst of symbolic culture, sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, is often seen as the defining moment of human uniqueness. But it likely didn't happen overnight. The cognitive groundwork was laid over hundreds of thousands of years, shaped by language, social complexity, and increasingly abstract thought. What changed is that these abilities began to externalize. Ideas were no longer just spoken or gestured. They were painted, carved, passed from mind to mind, not just by voice, but by artifact. This is when culture became truly cumulative, when knowledge could be refined, added to, remembered by the group rather than the individual. From this point forward, human evolution would no longer be driven solely by genes, but by ideas. With this explosion of cognition came new ways of living. Our ancestors began to build more complex shelters, create tailored clothing with bone needles, and manage landscapes with fire. They developed regional identities, different tool types, ornaments, rituals. Burial practices became more elaborate, suggesting belief in an afterlife or reverence for the dead. This is also when humans began to cross into environments that would have been impossible without planning and coordination. Arctic tundras, high-altitude plateaus, and eventually open ocean. Around 45,000 years ago, humans reached Australia, likely using rafts or simple boats. This required more than tools. It required imagination, the ability to envision places never seen, to trust in stories, to prepare for a journey guided only by stars and wind. Over the next tens of thousands of years, humans continued to explore, adapt, and settle across every habitable continent. Around 20,000 years ago, groups of humans in what is now Siberia began to cross into the Americas, likely via a land bridge that once connected Asia to Alaska, a corridor opened by the retreat of Ice Age glaciers. These early migrations were astonishing feats of endurance. They involved not only physical survival in freezing landscapes, but deep ecological knowledge, knowing where to find shelter, when to follow herds, how to preserve food. Within just a few millennia, humans had spread through the Americas, from the tundra of Canada to the rainforests of the Amazon and the mountains of the Andes. And everywhere they went, they adapted, not just biologically, but culturally. Language, tools, art, and belief systems evolved in parallel with the environment. This ability to adapt was our species' greatest evolutionary advantage. Unlike other hominins, whose tools and behaviors remained relatively stable for hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens thrived on change. In the Arctic, humans learned to hunt seal and caribou, to build insulated shelters, to craft parkas from animal skins. In the Pacific Islands, they became master navigators, reading swells, stars, and cloud patterns to voyage across thousands of kilometers of open water. In deserts, they found and stored water, tracked game across vast, empty expanses, and shaped social structures to cope with scarcity. No other animal on Earth has lived successfully in such a staggering range of conditions. Our tools evolved, yes, but more importantly, so did our ideas. And yet, for all our diversity, we remained one species. From the forests of Borneo to the highlands of Peru, the core of what made us human stayed the same. The ability to learn from each other, to tell stories, to imagine things that didn't yet exist. This shared cognitive infrastructure, flexible, symbolic, socially tuned, is what allowed small foraging bands to become village builders and eventually city dwellers. But that leap was still far in the future. For most of our history, we lived as hunter-gatherers, small, mobile, egalitarian. We followed the rhythms of the land, adapted to the seasons, and carried our belongings on our backs. And despite the romanticism of modern civilization, this way of life was remarkably sustainable. For nearly 95% of human existence, we lived in close relationship with nature, with each other, and with time itself. Then, around 12,000 years ago, something began to change. Slowly, unevenly, and not all at once. In a few scattered regions of the world, people stopped moving. They began to stay longer in certain places, returning year after year to river valleys, fertile floodplains and lake shores rich with fish and game. Some of these places offered abundant wild grains, others supported dense populations of animals. Over time, people began to plant seeds deliberately. They started to protect certain patches of land, to tend the soil, and to select for plants that were easier to harvest. This was the birth of agriculture, and with it, the Neolithic Revolution. It didn't happen everywhere. For thousands of years, farming and foraging coexisted. But where it took hold, it reshaped the human world completely. The first known centers of agriculture appeared in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, a crescent-shaped region spanning parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. Here, wheat and barley were among the first domesticated crops, along with lentils, peas, and flax. Animals like goats and sheep were also domesticated, followed later by cattle and pigs. Similar developments unfolded independently in other parts of the world. Rice and millet in China, yams and oil palm in West Africa, maize and squash in Mesoamerica, potatoes and quinoa in the Andes. Each region had its own path, its own suite of plants and animals, but the pattern was the same. With farming came food surpluses, and with surpluses came settlement. Permanent settlements changed everything. People built homes from mud brick and wood. They dug irrigation canals, stored grain in clay jars, and wove baskets and cloth. As villages grew, so did population density, and with it the complexity of social life. Labour became specialised. Some people farmed, others crafted tools or wove textiles or led rituals. Social hierarchies emerged. Land ownership and inheritance took shape. The rhythms of life shifted from the flexible pace of foraging to the structured routines of sowing and harvest. Time became measurable, tied to the seasons. And with more people living in close quarters, new challenges arose. Sanitation, disease, resource competition. Humans had stepped into a new phase of evolution, not biological but cultural. The environment we lived in was no longer just natural, it was something we had created. As villages grew into towns and towns into cities, human societies became increasingly complex. In Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, the Sumerians built the first true cities, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash. These urban centres were supported by vast irrigation systems and managed by priest-kings who claimed divine authority. To keep track of grain, labour and trade, they invented one of the most transformative technologies in human history, writing. The earliest writing was not used for poetry or storytelling, but for accounting. Clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform symbols recorded debts, harvests, and temple inventories. But over time, writing evolved, becoming a tool for law, literature, and memory. With it, human knowledge could transcend generations. Oral traditions, once passed from elder to child, were now etched in clay and stone. Similar developments occurred independently in other parts of the world. In the Nile Valley, ancient Egypt rose along the predictable rhythm of the annual flood, building monumental tombs, temples, and a culture obsessed with the afterlife. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa featured grid-planned streets, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights, evidence of central planning and complex governance. In China, along the Yellow River, early dynasties formed around ancestor worship and oracle bones, which were heated until they cracked and interpreted for divine insight. In the Americas, societies like the Olmec and later the Maya developed calendars, monumental architecture, and writing systems of their own. Though geographically distant, these civilizations were united by a shared pattern: the transformation of human life through surplus structure and shared belief. With civilization came new tensions. Hierarchies solidified, wealth concentrated, war became organized. Patriarchal structures, which were less pronounced in small foraging bands, grew more rigid. Human labor was harnessed on a massive scale, often unequally. Slavery, taxation, conquest, these systems emerged not because humans were suddenly more violent or greedy, but because larger, more complex societies required control and coordination, and those systems, once in place, tended to reinforce themselves. Still, even in these early empires, humans remained the same species that had painted cave walls and sat around firelight. We still needed stories, connection and meaning. And everywhere, from Sumer to Egypt, from the Andes to the Ganges, we told those stories in stone and song, in myth and math, in star maps and burial grounds. While early civilizations built ziggurats and pyramids, planted crops and raised armies, the biological evolution of Homo sapiens slowed. Our genes changed, of course, adapting gradually to diets, altitudes and disease pressures, but the most dramatic changes were now cultural. Evolution had moved from the slow pace of mutation to the rapid churn of invention. In just a few thousand years, a blink in evolutionary time, humans developed metallurgy, mathematics, sailing ships and sundials. They built trade networks that stretched across deserts and seas. They mapped the stars, devised calendars, recorded laws, and began to wonder more deeply about their place in the cosmos. This wasn't just technological advancement, it was a transformation of thought. For the first time, large populations could organize around abstract ideas, gods, nations, philosophies, and imagine futures far beyond the next harvest. Despite the geographic distance, these cultural evolutions often paralleled one another. In Greece, thinkers like Pythagoras and Aristotle tried to explain the world through reason and observation. In India, philosophers developed sophisticated systems of logic, cosmology, and ethics. In China, Confucianism and Taoism offered competing visions of social harmony and natural order. In the Middle East, mathematicians in Babylon calculated lunar cycles and square roots centuries before Euclid. The tools of civilization, writing, record-keeping, measurement, became tools of reflection. Slowly, humans began not just to live within nature, but to study it, and eventually, to test it. This shift would give rise many centuries later to what we now call science. But through it all, from the first seeds planted in the Fertile Crescent to the flowering of classical philosophy, our species remained deeply social, emotional, and embodied. We loved, mourned, danced and dreamed. We formed families, made music and told stories long before we built cities or calculated eclipses. Evolution had given us the raw material, big brains, dexterous hands, the capacity for language. But it was culture, cumulative, inventive, endlessly adaptive, that turned us into what we are today. And though we often speak of early humans as if they are gone, their legacy is not just in our bones. It's in every word we speak, every tool we use, every symbol we carry. The past is not behind us, it is within us. In evolutionary terms, even the rise of empires and global religions is recent. The Roman Republic, the Han Dynasty, the kingdoms of Nubia and Axum, all of these flourished within the last few thousand years. Agriculture, writing, metallurgy, and even cities are just slivers at the edge of a timeline that stretches back millions of years. If the entire span of human evolution were compressed into a 24-hour day, recorded history would begin only in the last few seconds before midnight. And yet, those final seconds have transformed the planet. The invention of the printing press, the voyages of exploration, the birth of modern science, the rise of industrial power. With each new discovery, our species reshaped the world, often faster than we could understand the consequences. The last few centuries have brought changes faster than evolution can keep up with. Our diets, our sleep cycles, our social structures, all now bear the imprint of technology. We fly across oceans, communicate across continents, and store more information in silicon than in synapses. In many ways, we've engineered our own environment, creating spaces where natural selection operates differently, if at all. Medicine has altered survival and reproduction. Global trade has equalized resources that once defined geography. And yet we remain biological beings built for an ancient rhythm. Our stress responses still prepare us for predators. Our craving for sugar and fat harks back to a time of scarcity. In our most modern moments, we carry the echoes of Pleistocene life. This mismatch between ancient minds and modern environments has sparked both innovation and instability. We've cured diseases once thought divine punishment, but created new epidemics of chronic illness. We've connected the world, but also sparked anxiety, isolation, and disinformation. We've built machines to calculate and automate, and now ask what remains uniquely human. But perhaps this is the next phase of our story, learning to live with the consequences of our own success. Evolution hasn't stopped. It has simply shifted from natural selection to cultural feedback. And now, for the first time in history, the fate of our species may depend not just on what we adapt to, but on what we choose. So where does that leave us? This clever, upright walking primate gazing out at the stars and inward at our own selves. It leaves us exactly where evolution always leaves its creations, in motion. We are not the end of the story. We are a chapter in it, one filled with extraordinary accomplishments, spaceflight, vaccines, symphonies, mathematics, but also with fragile systems and unresolved questions. We've mapped the human genome but still struggle to understand consciousness. We've walked on the moon, but often forget the depth of the earth beneath our feet. We are creatures of paradox, ancient yet inventive, tribal yet global, fragile yet astonishingly adaptable. And maybe that's the greatest legacy of our evolutionary past, not dominance, but resilience. The ability to navigate change, to collaborate, to imagine something better. These aren't modern traits, they're ancient ones, inherited not from kings or philosophers, but from foragers, fire starters, tool makers and caregivers, who faced hardship with shared memory and shared effort. Their story runs through us, in our bones, in our instincts, and in our impulse to understand. We are shaped not only by the struggles of survival, but by the bonds of community and the search for meaning. That, too, is evolution. So as you lie here now, perhaps beginning to drift, remember that your breath, your heartbeat, your thoughts, they all belong to a lineage billions of years old. You are not separate from the past. You are its continuation. In your cells you carry the chemistry of stars. In your senses the memory of forests and fire. And in your mind the spark of curiosity that has carried our species from the trees to the cosmos. May you rest well tonight, knowing that you are part of something vast, unfolding, and still very much alive.